The Atlantic coastline of New Jersey stretches beneath morning mist, the waters gray and restless. In West Long Branch, an immense limestone palace rises from manicured grounds, 130 rooms, Venetian-stained glass, 50 varieties of Italian marble, shadow lawn. The mansion sits quiet now, repurposed as university offices, its grand halls transformed into classrooms. Within these walls, 3 men tried to buy redemption with architecture. An insurance executive who stole from widows and orphans, a wireless telegraphy fraudster who stripped the house bare, a former embezzler who spent $10 million on a palace that would sell for 100. This is not a story about American royalty. This is a story about American delusion. Shadow Lawn has seen 3 versions of itself rise and fall. The first burned to ash after housing a convicted fraudster and a sitting president. The second stands today, built by a man whose criminal past he could never escape, whose ambition exceeded his means, and whose name would be synonymous with one of the Gilded Age's most spectacular collapses. Before we marvel at the stained glass ceiling that rises 70 feet above the Grand Hall, before we walk the marble staircases made famous in a Hollywood musical, we must first understand the men who built this place. Men who lied, men who stole, men who believed they could outrun their pasts. They could not. Welcome to Shadow Lawn, where fortunes were laundered, presidents campaigned, and dreams turned to smoke. The year is 1902. John Augustine McCall sits in his Manhattan office at the New York Life Insurance Company, contemplating retirement. At 53 years old, he has climbed from modest beginnings to the presidency of one of America's most powerful financial institutions. He controls assets worth hundreds of millions. He mingles with Vanderbilts and Rockefellers. But success, McCall has learned, requires maintenance. It requires appearances. And nothing maintains appearances quite like a summer palace by the sea. McCall purchases 65 acres in West Long Branch, New Jersey, adjacent to the summer homes of the Guggenheims. Here, presidents have vacationed since Grant. Here, the wealthy escape the sweltering summers of New York to take the salt air, to be seen. McCall hires architect Henry Edward Crégier, son of the mayor of Chicago. The design must evoke European grandeur. The mansion must suggest the Alhambra, the Petit Trianon, Sans Souci. It must whisper that John McCall has arrived, but whisper loudly enough for everyone to hear. By August of 1903, Shadow Lawn rises on a grassy knoll 50 feet above the ocean. 52 rooms, 3 stories, and 2 vast porticos. Gold-plated plumbing, 3 conservatories producing grapes, peaches, and pears. From the 3rd floor atrium, 2 pillared lookout towers command views across the estate and down to the sea. The name itself carries weight. Shadow Lawn. The great trees throw their shadows across the manicured grass, creating patterns of light and dark, revelation and concealment. It is a perfect name for a house built with stolen money, because John McCall is a thief. For years, he has been systematically looting the New York Life Insurance Company, funneling policyholders' premiums into his own pockets. He has bribed state legislators. He has falsified records. He has transformed an institution meant to protect widows and orphans into his personal treasury. And he has done it all while building a summer palace that the newspapers call the White House by the Sea. In 1905, the Armstrong investigation tears open the insurance industry. A New York legislative committee, led by Senator William W. Armstrong and Chief Counsel Charles Evans Hughes, the same Hughes who will later face Wilson in the 1916 election, begins examining the business practices of the major insurance companies. What they find is staggering. The investigation reveals a system of corruption that touches every major insurance company in New York. Executives pay themselves enormous salaries while denying legitimate claims. They create elaborate schemes to hide profits and manipulate stock prices. They funnel company money into political campaigns, purchasing legislators like commodities. They operate with complete impunity, protected by the very politicians they have bought. John McCall's testimony before the committee is devastating. Under Charles Evans Hughes's relentless questioning, McCall admits to bribing state legislators. He admits to using policyholders' money for political purposes. he admits to falsifying company records. The man who built Shadow Lawn as a symbol of respectability is exposed as a common thief. The newspapers have a field day. Editorial cartoons depict insurance executives as vultures feeding on widows and orphans. Public outrage forces reforms. New York passes strict insurance regulations. Other states follow. The industry is transformed overnight. But for John McCall, reform comes too late. He is found to have personally bribed state legislators with $275,000 of company money, equivalent to millions in today's currency. He is ordered to repay the full amount. He resigns his presidency in disgrace. His reputation, built over decades, collapses in weeks. Shadow Lawn must be sold. In early 1906, shortly before his death, McCall sells the mansion for $350,000 to Myron Oppenheim, a New York attorney. But Oppenheim's country club vision collapses within a year. The mansion sits empty. McCall dies in February of 1906. Cirrhosis of the liver, the death certificate reads. But those who knew him speak of the toll the scandal took. The New York Daily Tribune reports that the insurance scandal resulted in what many believe was a tragic death from heartbreak. In 1907, a new owner arrives. His name is Abraham White, though he was born Abraham Schwartz in Corsicana, Texas. He has made a fortune in wireless telegraphy and postage stamp speculation. The newspapers call him the postage stamp capitalist. Those who know better call him a con man. White purchases Shadow Lawn for $500,000, immediately renaming it White Park. He tells reporters he bought the mansion for his wife, whose singing voice he claims is the most beautiful in America. She will perform for their guests in the grand mezzanine hall. What is certainly true is that Abraham White is running multiple fraudulent schemes. His United Wireless Telegraph Company is built on false promises and inflated stock values. He sells stock by claiming his wireless system is superior to Marconi's, that he has Navy contracts, that profits are imminent. None of it is true. For one summer season in 1907, Abraham and Mrs. White occupy Shadow Lawn. They entertain. They mingle with the Morgans, the Guggenheims, the Rockefellers. They are briefly accepted into that world where wealth confers its own virtue. But White's schemes are collapsing. The mortgage goes into foreclosure. As his financial house of cards tumbles, White strips the mansion of everything valuable. The silver chandeliers disappear. The doorknobs are unscrewed and pocketed. Decorative fixtures vanish. White stiffs the tradesman. Then he flees back to Texas. Shadow Lawn returns to the market. Oppenheim repurchases the property at a sheriff's auction for $125,000. He tries once more to establish his country club, but it fails again. In 1909, Shadow Lawn is sold for the 5th time in 7 years, this time to Colonel Joseph Benedict Greenhut. In 1910, Abraham White is convicted of larceny. After that, the historical record goes quiet. Colonel Joseph Benedict Greenhut is different from his predecessors. The head of the Siegel Cooper department store empire, Greenhut is a legitimate businessman. He purchases Shadow Lawn in 1909 for $200,000 and spends an additional $400,000 on renovations. Finally, the mansion finds an owner who intends to stay. Greenhut will own Shadow Lawn for 9 years. They will be the most stable years in the mansion's history. They will also bring Shadow Lawn to the center of American political life. In 1915, Colonel Greenhut offers his home to President Woodrow Wilson as a summer White House. Wilson accepts. For the presidential election campaign of 1916, Shadow Lawn becomes the stage for Wilson's re-election effort. On September 2, 1916, thousands gather on the lawn to hear President Wilson deliver his renomination acceptance speech. The event is carefully orchestrated. A wooden platform has been erected in front of the mansion's portico. American flags drape the columns. Bands play patriotic music. Newsreel cameras record the event for theater audiences across the nation. He stands before the mansion's great portico, framed by white columns, surrounded by American flags. The crowd stretches across the grass, down past the formal gardens, nearly to the property line. Reporters from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, and dozens of other newspapers record every word. This is the most important political speech of the year, delivered not from the Capitol or the White House, but from a private estate in New Jersey. Wilson speaks for over an hour. Europe is at war. The Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, are locked in brutal combat with the Allies, Britain, France, Russia, Italy. Millions have died in the trenches. Chemical weapons have been deployed. Submarine warfare threatens neutral shipping. American citizens have died, most notably in the sinking of the Lusitania in May of 1915. Wilson must convince voters that he can maintain both peace and honor, an impossible balance that will prove unsustainable. He must appear strong enough to protect American interests, but restrained enough to avoid war. He must satisfy both the interventionists who want to enter the conflict on the Allied side and the isolationists who want America to remain neutral at all costs. Wilson declares that the Republican Party cannot meet the new conditions of a new age, that the day of little Americanism is past and gone. He positions himself as the candidate of progress, of internationalism, of modern governance. The Democratic campaign adopts the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Shadow Lawn becomes associated with this promise. Rally after rally is held on the grounds. The election is close. On election night, it appears Wilson has lost to Republican Charles Evans Hughes. But by morning, California swings to Wilson. He wins re-election by one of the narrowest margins in American history. Theodore Roosevelt, twice president and perpetually bitter, writes a mocking poem that includes the line, "There are shadows on the lawn at Shadow Lawn." He means it as criticism of Wilson's foreign policy. But the line resonates beyond Roosevelt's intended meaning. Edith Wilson, the president's second wife, will later write of Shadow Lawn in her memoirs. Very large, with a staircase wide enough for an army abreast, opposite the front door. This staircase ended in a big platform on which rested a grand piano. Then the stairs parted to run in opposite directions, as if each was ashamed of the other. When we got settled, we were happy and comfortable at Shadow Lawn. The Wilsons never return after the election. On April 2nd, 1917, Wilson asks Congress to declare war on Germany. The promise of Shadow Lawn is broken. Colonel Greenhut dies in 1918. The mansion is once again for sale. Hubert Templeton Parson was born in 1872 in Lockport, New York, a canal town that had prospered in the Erie Canal era, but was declining by the time of his birth. His family was working class, his father likely employed in one of the town's mills or factories. Education was limited. Opportunities were scarce. Parson left school early to work, as most working-class boys did in that era. The young Parson found work as a bookkeeper, a position that required numeracy but not extensive formal education. He was good with numbers, precise, careful, reliable. These were valuable skills in the expanding industrial economy of the late 19th century. But Parson was also ambitious, hungering for more than a bookkeeper's modest wages and limited prospects. In his early career, working for a firm whose name has been lost to history, Parson embezzled funds from his employers. The amounts were not enormous by the standards of Gilded Age theft, likely a few $1,000s rather than the hundreds of thousands that men like McCall stole. But embezzlement is embezzlement. Theft is theft. The crime was discovered. Parson was caught. He faced criminal prosecution. His career appeared over before it had truly begun. In that era, a conviction for embezzlement meant permanent ruin. No respectable firm would hire a known thief. Parson faced not just unemployment, but unemployability. But Parson possessed a quality rarer than honesty. He possessed a champion. Frank Woolworth, the five-and-dime store magnate, took an interest in the disgraced bookkeeper. Woolworth hired Parson, paid off his debts, and gave him an opportunity to rebuild. Parson seized that opportunity. He rose through the Woolworth organization with remarkable speed. He proved himself adept at expansion, at management, at retail logistics. By 1918, Hubert Parson had become president of the F.W. Woolworth Company, commanding a salary of $650,000 a year, from embezzler to company president in a single generation. It is a very American story, but it is also a story of insecurity, of a man who can never quite escape his past, who must constantly prove himself. In 1918, Parson purchases Shadow Lawn from Green Hut's heirs for $800,000. He expands the estate to 108 acres. He envisions Shadow Lawn as a completely self-sufficient compound. He and his wife Maisie take possession in the summer of 1918. They plan extensive renovations. The Parsons already live in extraordinary luxury. They own a mansion at 1071 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. They own a Parisian estate on Avenue Foch. Now they will have their palace by the sea. But on January 27, 1927, Shadow Lawn burns. The fire starts in the late evening of January 27th. Exactly how it begins is never definitively determined. The investigation afterward will point to several possibilities. An electrical short in the aging wiring system, a forgotten cigarette in one of the servants' quarters, a spark from one of the many fireplaces that heats the sprawling structure. The mansion, for all its grandeur, is built primarily of wood. Victorian-era construction methods prioritized appearance over fire safety. There are no firewalls, no sprinkler systems, no modern safety features. By the time the flames are spotted, likely by a passing motorist on the road outside the estate, the wooden structure is already engulfed. The fire appears to have started in the servants' wing and spread rapidly through the interconnected structure. Fire departments from West Long Branch, El Baron, and surrounding communities respond with their equipment, but they face insurmountable challenges. The mansion is too large for the equipment available. The water pressure from local hydrants is inadequate for a structure this size. The nearest fire hydrant is hundreds of feet from the building. The firefighters can only watch as Shadow Lawn consumes itself. Their efforts focused on preventing the fire from spreading to neighboring properties and the estate's outbuildings. Witnesses report seeing the flames from 20 miles away. The orange glow lights up the night sky. By morning, only rubble remains. Only one chimney still stands, a solitary finger pointing at the sky. The loss is estimated at $1,250,000. Parson had spent $1 million renovating the mansion. Now it is ash. Another man might have walked away. Another man might have taken the insurance money and invested elsewhere. But Hubert Parson is not that man. He will rebuild, but he will not rebuild the same mansion. He will build something greater, something that will eclipse every other private residence in America, except possibly Biltmore. He will build his redemption in limestone and marble. It will destroy him. Parson hires Horace Trumbauer, one of America's most prestigious architects. Trumbauer's portfolio includes mansions for Wideners and Dukes, libraries for Harvard, museums for Philadelphia. His chief designer is Julian Abele, one of the first professionally trained African-American architects in the United States. Together, they have created some of the most elegant Beaux-Arts structures in America. Parsons' instructions are explicit. The new Shadow Lawn must be fireproof. It must be built of steel, concrete, and Indiana limestone, the same limestone used in the Empire State Building. It must evoke Versailles. It must contain at least 130 rooms. It must feature 50 different varieties of Italian marble. And it must include a glass ceiling over the grand hall, a ceiling of Venetian stained glass spanning 100 feet and rising 70 feet above the floor. The estimated cost is $10 million. In 1927, $10 million is astronomical. The average American worker earns perhaps $1,500 a year. Parson is proposing to spend the lifetime earnings of nearly 7,000 workers on a summer house. Construction proceeds through 1927 and 1928. The project employs hundreds of workers at its peak. Italian stonemasons from New York are brought in to handle the specialized marble work. Stonemasons cut and lay the Indiana limestone with precision, each block fitting perfectly with its neighbors. Iron workers erect the massive steel frame that makes the building fireproof. Expert craftsmen install 50 different varieties of Italian marble, each selected for specific rooms and purposes. Carrara for the staircases, travertine for the floors, rare colored marbles for decorative accents. The construction site operates like a small city. Temporary buildings house supplies. On-site workshops allow craftsmen to custom-fit materials. Trucks arrive daily with limestone from Indiana, marble from Italy, glass from Venice, wood from rare forests. The The project employs not just construction workers, but artisans, glassworkers, metal workers, wood carvers, painters, gilders. Each brings specialized skills to create specific elements of the mansion. Trumbauer and Abele create a masterpiece of American Beaux-Arts architecture. The facade is pure French classical revival, symmetrical and imposing. The exterior is formal, restrained, elegant. The interior is a fantasy of marble, gilt, and glass. 17 master suites, each decorated in a different historical period. Louis XV, Louis XVI, Georgian, Victorian, Regency, Empire, Colonial, Oriental. Each suite is a complete historical environment with furniture, fixtures, and decorative elements that would satisfy the most demanding curator. 19 bathrooms with gold and silver-plated fixtures, each bathroom designed to complement its adjacent suite's period style. A 2-lane bowling alley in the lower level, complete with automatic pin-setting machinery. A swimming pool with walls of Italian marble and a gold-mirrored ceiling that creates the illusion of infinite space. A full gymnasium with the latest exercise equipment and a large shower room finished in white tile. A theater with stage, professional lighting, and seating for intimate performances. A ballroom with sprung floors for dancing. A wood-paneled library with built-in bookcases and a fireplace. A billiard room with championship-quality table and custom lighting, and the English lounge. Parson has purchased a 16th-century Tudor abbey in England, had it dismantled stone by stone, shipped across the Atlantic, and carefully reconstructed in Shadow Lawn's lower level. The oak paneling is genuine. The carved details are original. The grand hall is the showpiece. It rises through 3 floors, encircled by balconies. The marble staircases sweep upward in dramatic curves, meeting at a landing before dividing again. The balustrades are carved marble, and above it all, the stained glass ceiling, 100 feet across, 70 feet above the floor, Venetian stained glass in intricate patterns. When the sun shines through, the hall floods with colored light. At night, 165 electric lights illuminate the glass from above. The organ is another extraordinary feature. Costing $100,000 alone, it can be remotely controlled from various points in the house. The pipes are hidden behind gilded grills. The sound, when the organ plays, fills the entire mansion. Shadow Lawn was completed in late summer of 1929. Parson and Maisie take residence in August. They employ more than 70 servants for the house alone, plus 30 more to maintain the grounds. Over 100 people exist to support the lifestyle of 3 human beings. It is obscene, it is magnificent, and it is perfectly timed to coincide with the end of that world. On October 24th, 1929, barely 2 months after the Parsons moved in, the stock market began to collapse. Black Thursday. By Black Tuesday, October 29th, the market had lost billions in value. Fortunes evaporate. Hubert Parsons' wealth is almost entirely in Woolworth stock. As the market crashes, he watches his fortune dissolve. The stock loses 80% of its value practically overnight. But the expenses do not vanish. 100 employees still require salaries. The property taxes still come due. The mortgage payments still must be made. And Maisie still has plans. At the last minute, as Shadow Lawn neared completion, Maisie decided she wanted a solarium on the roof. A glass-enclosed room where she could take the sun and look out over the ocean. Never mind that the house was nearly finished. Never mind that adding a structure to the roof would destroy the building's symmetry. Never mind that the stock market had just crashed. Mrs. Parson wants it. Horace Trumbauer argues vehemently against the addition. The solarium will ruin the architectural integrity of the mansion. It will require removing 3 floors of exterior limestone cladding. It will necessitate demolishing sections of the freshly completed interior to install new steel supports. Parsons' response is simple. Mrs. Parson wants it. The solarium is built. The final bill for this single last-minute addition is $500,000. $500,000 spent after the crash, after Parsons' fortune has evaporated, after the Great Depression has begun. James T. Mayer, in his book The Twilight of Splendor, describes the Parsons. Parson was just another rich and talented businessman with no taste, and his wife was a not untypical spoiled and willful woman who, rather than acknowledge the realities of the Great Depression, drove her husband into bankruptcy. Life at Shadow Lawn in the early 1930s is surreal. Outside the gates, America is in economic freefall. Unemployment reaches 25%. 13 million Americans out of work. Banks fail by the thousands. Over 9,000 banks will close between 1930 and 1933, wiping out the savings of millions. Breadlines stretch around city blocks in every major city. Shanty towns called Hoovervilles, named bitterly after President Herbert Hoover, spring up in vacant lots and public parks. Homeless families live in packing crates and tar paper shacks. Farmers, hit by both the Depression and the beginning of the Dust Bowl, lose their land to foreclosure at rates never seen before. Farm prices collapse. Wheat that sold for $1 a bushel in 1929 sells for 30 cents by 1932. Families that have worked the same land for generations pack their belongings into jalopies and head west, hoping for work that does not exist. Industrial production drops by nearly half. The stock market, which peaked at 381 in September of 1929, bottoms at 41 in July of 1932. A loss of nearly 90%. Billions in wealth simply vanishes. Men who were millionaires on paper find themselves with nothing. Some leap from office buildings. Others simply walk away from everything they built. And at Shadow Lawn, Hubert and Maisie Parson maintain their palace as if nothing has changed. They keep the full staff. They maintain the grounds to perfection. They operate the greenhouses and the dairy. The swimming pool is cleaned. The bowling alley is polished. The theater sits ready for performances that never come. Because no one visits Shadow Lawn, the 17 master suites remain empty. The 19 bathrooms with their gold-plated fixtures serve only 3 people: Hubert, Maisie, and Maisie's sister, Bertha. Every morning, Parson takes his breakfast in the Pompeii-style breakfast room, accompanied by the thunder of the organ playing hymns. Then he commutes to New York, to the Woolworth Building, where he presides over a company slowly drowning in the Depression. Every evening, he returns to Shadow Lawn, dinner in the Versailles dining room, an evening in the library or the billiard room, then bed in his suite. At 10:30, the lights go out, and Shadow Lawn falls dark, 130 rooms settling into silence. The bills, meanwhile, continue to arrive. By 1932, Parson's financial situation was dire. His Woolworth stock is now worth a fraction of its peak value. Then comes the final blow. In 1932, Parson reached Woolworth's mandatory retirement age of 60. He loses his $650,000 annual salary. Frank Woolworth, the benevolent mentor, is long dead. There is no one left to bail him out. The federal government begins pursuing Parson for unpaid taxes. The borough of West Long Branch threatens to cut off sewer service. Creditors circle. In 1936, Metropolitan Life forecloses on 1071 Fifth Avenue. The Manhattan Mansion is gone. In 1937, Parson closes his Parisian estate and ships the furniture back to New Jersey. Shadow Lawn fills with the overspill from France. The palace becomes a storage facility. In 1937, Parson put Shadow Lawn on the market for $10 million. No one is interested. The Depression has eliminated the market for massive estates. The price drops. Still no buyers. In 1938, the municipality of West Long Branch foreclosed on Shadow Lawn for unpaid taxes. The mansion that cost $10 million to build is sold at public auction. The winning bid, $100. The municipality immediately sells Shadow Lawn to a private girls' school. The Parsons are allowed to remain temporarily while the contents are prepared for auction. In 1940, the auction takes place. The event is advertised in newspapers across the region. Dealers, collectors, bargain hunters, and the merely curious descend on Shadow Lawn for what is billed as one of the most significant estate sales of the decade. Everything goes: the furniture, genuine Louis XV pieces, Louis XVI chairs and tables, Georgian sideboards, acquired at great expense from dealers in New York and Paris, the artwork, oil paintings in gilded frames, sculptures in marble and bronze, the gilt mirrors that line the halls, each one custom-made, the massive crystal chandeliers, the silk draperies, custom woven in France, the Persian rugs that cover marble floors, the potted palms, the candelabras, even decorative objects, vases, clocks, figurines. Buyers walk through Shadow Lawn with notebooks and catalogs, examining the remnants of the Parsons lives, calculating values, placing bids. Dealers look for pieces they can resell. Collectors search for bargains. Some local residents simply want a memento of the famous mansion. The auction lasts several days, moving methodically, room by room. Monday, the public rooms on the first floor. Tuesday, the master suites on the second floor. Wednesday, the guest rooms and recreational facilities. Each day brings fresh crowds, fresh bidding, fresh departures of furnishings that took years to accumulate. Hubert Templeton. Parson watches his life's work dismantled piece by piece. Everything he built to prove he was not an embezzler, everything he created to establish himself as legitimate, all of it carried out the door by strangers. 2 weeks after the auction concludes, Hubert Parson dies. He is 68 years old. Shadow Lawn does not die with Hubert Parson. Instead, it transforms. The private girls' school operates in the mansion from 1938 until 1955. Young women attend classes in the former master suites. The palace built for 3 serves hundreds. In 1955, the building was purchased by Monmouth Junior College for $350,000. The college becomes Monmouth University. The mansion became known as Woodrow Wilson Hall, honoring its brief moment as the Summer White House. The 17 master suites become offices and classrooms. Desks replace beds. Filing cabinets occupy spaces where armoires once stood. In the 1980s, as part of Monmouth University's 50th anniversary, the mansion underwent restoration. The stained glass ceiling is cleaned, the marble is resealed. In 1985, Shadow Lawn received National Historic Landmark designation from the United States Department of the Interior. The designation recognizes the building as possessing exceptional historical significance. In 1980, the Grand Hall served as a location for scenes in the film Annie. The marble staircases, the stained glass ceiling, the ornate balconies all appear on screen as Daddy Warbucks' Park Avenue mansion. The famous scene of Annie and the orphans sliding down the banister was filmed here. Millions of people see Shadow Lawn without knowing its name, without knowing its history. In 2020, Monmouth University removed the name Woodrow Wilson Hall, reflecting growing awareness of Wilson's record on race. The university reverts to the original name, Shadow Lawn. 3 men built Shadow Lawn, each in his own image. John McCall built a palace to disguise his theft. Abraham White bought a palace to legitimize his frauds. Hubert Parson built a palace to escape his past. All 3 failed. McCall died disgraced, his reputation destroyed by the Armstrong investigation. White fled in the night, his schemes collapsed. Parson died penniless, watching strangers auction off his dream. Shadow Lawn was built 3 times. Twice it was purchased by criminals seeking to launder their reputations. Once it burned, once it was foreclosed. It housed a president during an election campaign that would lead America into World War I. It stands today not as a private palace, but as a public institution. There is a brutal poetry in Shadow Lawn's survival. The mansion that was meant to glorify individual ego now serves collective purpose. The house built to establish legitimacy now teaches students. The palace that was supposed to separate the wealthy from the common now welcomes all. But we should not romanticize this transformation. Shadow Lawn remains what it always was, a monument to American excess. The fact that it now serves a university does not erase its origins in fraud. $10 million in 1929. The lifetime earnings of 7,000 workers, spent on a summer house for 3 people. While outside the gates, America collapsed into depression. Today, Shadow Lawn serves as the administrative heart of Monmouth University. The president's office occupies Bertha Gask's former suite. Other administrators work in the former master suites. The Pompey breakfast room and Versailles dining room host meetings and receptions. The bowling alley and swimming pool are long gone, converted to other uses. But the Grand Hall remains magnificent. The stained glass ceiling still catches the sunlight. The marble staircases still sweep upward. Students walk through daily, most barely noticing the extraordinary craftsmanship surrounding them. To them, it is simply the administrative building, but for visitors who know the history, Shadow Lawn remains powerful. The scale impresses. The materials are astonishing. The craftsmanship speaks of an era when money was no object. The mansion hosts weddings and other events, generating revenue for the university. Couples marry in the grand hall beneath that spectacular stained glass ceiling. They pose for photographs on the famous Annie Steps. Shadow Lawn has become what Parson never intended, a public space, accessible to all, serving the common good. Shadow Lawn tells a larger story about American wealth and American dreams. It is the story of men who believed that money could buy legitimacy, that architecture could confer virtue, that if you built a palace magnificent enough, no one would remember where you came from. They were wrong. The Gilded Age produced dozens of shadow lawns, marble palaces on Fifth Avenue, Newport cottages the size of European castles. Most are gone now. The few that remain tell the same story. Wealth without wisdom, ambition without ethics, dreams that collapsed under their own weight. We walk through these spaces today, marveling at the craftsmanship, the materials, the scale of ambition. We take photographs. We imagine what it must have been like. But we should also remember the cost, the workers who quarried the limestone, who laid the marble, who built this palace for wages that could never allow them to live in such a place, the servants who maintained the grounds for modest pay, the ordinary Americans whose labor created the wealth that built these palaces, the communities that suffered when men like McCall stole from insurance companies meant to protect widows and orphans. Shadow Lawn is beautiful. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The architecture is historically significant. Shadow Lawn is also obscene. The expense was grotesque. The purpose was vanity. The result was tragedy. Both realities exist simultaneously. We can preserve it, study it, use it, while also acknowledging what it represents. The mansion survives because Parsons' downfall came at the exact moment when private palaces became unmarketable. It was saved by public use, transformed from a monument to private greed into an institution serving public good. The stained glass ceiling in Shadow Lawn's Grand Hall rises 70 feet above the marble floor, 100 feet across. Venetian glass in panels of blue and gold and crimson. When the afternoon sun streams through, the light breaks into fragments, scattering color across the balconies and walls. It is the architectural opposite of its name. Shadow Lawn should be dark, concealing. But Parson and Trumbauer and Abele created a space filled with light. Perhaps that was always the point. Perhaps all the men who built Shadow Lawn were chasing the same thing. Light. Light to dispel the shadows of their pasts. Light to illuminate their achievements. Light to blind observers to the darkness at the foundation. But light and shadow are inseparable. You cannot have one without the other. The brighter the light, the darker the shadow it casts. Shadow Lawn stands today as a monument to that paradox. A palace built by fraudsters and embezzlers now serves education. A summer White House for a president who promised peace and delivered war now hosts student activities. A $10 million mansion foreclosed for $100 now generates revenue through weddings. A private palace now serves public good. The transformation is not redemption. Redemption implies forgiveness, absolution. Shadow Lawn has not been redeemed. Its history remains indelible. But transformation is real. The building serves a different purpose now. The rooms that once housed vanity now house learning. The halls that echoed with organ music now echo with student voices. Every student who walks through Shadow Lawn's halls, every couple who marries beneath that stained glass ceiling, every visitor who learns its history becomes part of an ongoing story. The story shifts from private tragedy to public utility. The building that was supposed to serve 3 now serves thousands. The palace meant to establish one man's legitimacy now provides education to generations of students. The shadow that was meant to conceal now reveals, teaches, warns. Shadow Lawn will never escape its history, nor should it. The history is part of what makes it significant, what makes it worth preserving and studying. In the end, Shadowlawn is more powerful in its public life than it ever was in its private glory. It serves as a reminder that no fortune is safe, no reputation secure, no palace permanent. It warns about the dangers of excess, the inevitable collapse that follows unchecked ambition. And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates that buildings can outlive their original purposes, can transcend their creators' intentions, can serve better ends than those for which they were built. The palace built for vanity now serves education. The monument to excess now teaches restraint. Shadowlawn grows smaller in the distance, one building among many along the New Jersey coast, then disappears into the landscape. The Atlantic stretches to the horizon. The sun sets, casting long shadows across the university campus. Somewhere in West Long Branch, in a mansion that cost $10 million and sold for $100, in a palace that outlasted the men who built it, the lights come on. Classes resume, students study, life continues, the building remains, the story continues, the lessons endure. On a hillside above Beverly Hills, hidden behind iron gates and towering hedges, stands a limestone palace that looks like it was lifted from the English countryside and placed under the California sun. Graystone Mansion rises from manicured lawns, its gray stone walls catching the light in a way that seems almost ethereal. 55 rooms stretch across 46,000 square feet. Formal gardens cascade down the slope. A bowling alley and billiard room wait in silence. From certain windows, you can see all the way to the Pacific Ocean, a view that once belonged to oil and power and unimaginable wealth. But walk through those rooms today, and you'll feel something else beneath the beauty, a heaviness, a shadow that no amount of sunlight can erase. Because Graystone Mansion wasn't just the crowning achievement of an oil empire, it became its tomb. On a cold February night in 1929, just months after the family moved in, 2 gunshots shattered the silence. By morning, the heir to one of America's greatest fortunes lay dead in a guest bedroom. His secretary lay dead beside him. The official story claimed that a trusted employee had lost his mind and done them both in before the authorities could arrive. But whispers told a different tale, one involving corruption, blackmail, and secrets powerful enough to destroy a dynasty. The deaths were never fully explained, the questions were never answered, and the mansion that was meant to crown an empire instead became the symbol of its collapse. Some say Graystone was cursed from the moment its foundation was laid. Others say the curse began long before, in oil fields soaked with ambition and stained by scandal. Either way, the story of Graystone is the story of how wealth built on shadows can never escape the darkness. To understand Graystone, you must first understand the man who built it, Edward Lawrence Doheny. His story reads like the American dream, written in oil and ambition. Born in 1856 in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, Edward grew up with nothing. His father worked odd jobs. His mother struggled to keep food on the table. When Edward was old enough, he headed west, like so many young men of his generation, searching for fortune in the raw landscapes of the frontier. He tried everything. He worked as a mule packer in New Mexico. He prospected for gold and silver in Arizona and Mexico, sleeping under stars, eating whatever he could hunt or trade for. He dug through rock and sand with his bare hands, chasing rumors of strikes that never materialized. For years, he lived on the edge of poverty, always one step away from finding his fortune, never quite reaching it. The desert sun burned his skin. The cold mountain nights left him shivering in thin blankets. He watched other men strike it rich while his own pockets stayed empty. But Edward refused to give up. Failure only hardened his determination. Then, in his 30s, tired and worn down by decades of disappointment, Edward settled in Los Angeles. The city was still small then, dusty and unremarkable, hardly the sprawling metropolis it would become. Most people passed through on their way to somewhere else. But Edward, now married to his first wife Carrie, decided to stay. He scraped together what little money he had and began looking for something different. Oil. In 1892, on a vacant lot near downtown Los Angeles, Edward Doheny and his partner Charles Canfield began digging. They didn't have fancy equipment or wealthy investors backing them. They used a sharpened eucalyptus tree trunk as a drill. They worked by hand hour after hour, day after day. driving that wooden drill deeper into the California soil. Their hands blistered and bled. Their backs ached. The neighbors thought they were insane, two more foolish dreamers wasting their time on an impossible venture. But on a day in November, at 460 feet, the drill broke through. Oil surged up from the earth, thick and black and valuable. It was the first successful oil well in the Los Angeles basin, and it changed everything. Within months, the city transformed. Oil derricks sprouted like iron forests across Los Angeles. Land that had been worthless overnight became priceless. Edward Doheny, the broke prospector who had spent decades chasing dreams through deserts and mountains, suddenly found himself at the center of a fortune so large it seemed unreal. He didn't stop. He couldn't. The hunger that had driven him through all those years of failure now drove him toward even greater success. He expanded. He bought land across California and Mexico. His wells produced millions of barrels. His wealth grew into tens of millions, then hundreds of millions. By the early 1900s, Edward L. Doheny was one of the richest men in America, a titan of the oil industry, a king among millionaires. He moved into a mansion in Los Angeles. He built a second estate. He surrounded himself with art, luxury, and power. After his first wife died, he married Carrie Estelle Betzold, a woman of grace and intelligence who stood beside him as his fortune climbed higher and higher. Together, they had one son, Edward Lawrence Doheny Jr., known to everyone as Ned. Ned grew up in a world his father could never have imagined as a child. Private schools, European travel, society parties, the finest clothes and the best education money could buy. He was charming, handsome, and well-liked. Tall and athletic, with an easy smile and natural charisma, Ned moved through elite social circles with confidence. He served in the Navy during World War I and returned home a decorated officer, praised for his leadership and courage. In 1921, Ned married Lucy Marceline Smith, a beautiful young woman from a prominent family. The wedding was one of the social events of the season, attended by Los Angeles' wealthiest and most influential families. Edward Doheny loved his son more than anything. He saw in Ned everything he himself had never been: educated, refined, accepted by society. He wanted to give Ned the kind of life he himself had never known. He wanted to build something that would last forever, something that would crown the Doheny name with glory and establish the family among America's aristocracy. So, in the mid-1920s, as his oil empire reached its peak, he decided to build Ned a house. Not just any house, a palace, a monument, a masterpiece that would stand as proof that the Doheny family had arrived at the pinnacle of American society. He chose 18 acres on a hillside in Beverly Hills, high above the city, where the air was clean and the views stretched forever. The land itself cost a fortune. The construction would cost even more. Edward didn't care. Money, after all those years of poverty, had become almost meaningless. This was for Ned. This was for legacy. This was for immortality. This was Greystone. In 1927, construction began. The architect was Gordon Kaufman, a brilliant designer who had studied the great estates of England and Europe. Kaufman had recently emigrated from England and brought with him a deep understanding of classical architecture and Gothic design. Edward Doheny told him to spare no expense. Build something that will last 1,000 years. Build something that feels like royalty. Build something that will make people stop and stare in wonder. Kaufman delivered. The mansion was designed in the English Gothic Revival style, with influences from Tudor manor houses and medieval castles. The exterior was clad in gray Indiana limestone, shipped across the country at enormous cost. Each block was carefully selected, cut, and fitted. The stone gave the building a timeless, almost ancient quality, as if it had stood on that hillside for centuries rather than being newly built. The roof used slate tiles imported from Vermont. The windows were leaded glass, each pane handcrafted. The doors were solid oak, carved with intricate details. Every material was chosen for beauty and permanence. This was not a house that would age or decay. This was a structure built to outlast generations. The main house contained 55 rooms spread across multiple floors. The grand entry hall featured a sweeping staircase, carved wood paneling that reached to the ceiling, and a floor of polished marble. Walking into Greystone for the first time felt like entering a European palace. The living room was designed to host grand parties, with space for 100 guests to mingle comfortably. Tall windows flooded the room with natural light. The dining room could seat dozens around a table long enough to accommodate formal state dinners. A library held thousands of books, its shelves lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes. There were sitting rooms, music rooms, sunrooms, and private chambers for family and guests. Beneath the main floors, a basement level included service areas, storage, and some of the most unusual features of the estate. A bowling alley stretched the length of a city block, complete with polished lanes and a professional setup. A billiard room offered space for games and smoking, its walls paneled in dark wood that gave it the atmosphere of a private gentleman's club. There were wine cellars capable of storing thousands of bottles, silver vaults to protect the family's valuable tableware, and a network of hallways where staff could move unseen, ensuring that the family's needs were met without disrupting the atmosphere of elegance above. The estate's grounds were just as impressive as the house itself. Formal gardens stretched in geometric patterns, with hedges trimmed to perfection. European landscaping techniques created outdoor rooms, each with its own character and purpose. Fountains bubbled in courtyard spaces. Paths wound through groves of trees carefully selected for their beauty and shade. There was a tennis court surfaced with red clay, a swimming pool lined with imported tile, and open lawns for croquet and garden parties. Stone staircases descended through multiple levels of terracing, creating dramatic views and intimate spaces. From the upper terraces, the view extended across Los Angeles to the ocean, a constant reminder of how far the Doheny fortune had climbed. Inside, the mansion was outfitted with the most modern technology of the era. Central heating and air systems, still rare in private homes, ensured comfort year-round. Elevators connected the floors so that no one had to climb stairs unless they wanted to. A sophisticated intercom system allowed communication between rooms. Fireplaces appeared in nearly every major room, each one faced with imported marble or carved stone. The kitchens were equipped with commercial-grade appliances that could have served a hotel. The bathrooms featured tile work and fixtures that rivaled the finest establishments in the world. The total cost of Greystone was estimated at $3 million to $4 million, an astronomical sum in the 1920s. To put that in perspective, the average American home cost around $5,000. Adjusted for inflation, Greystone would be worth over $60 million today. And that doesn't account for the artistry and craftsmanship that would be nearly impossible to replicate now. But for Edward Doheny, it was worth every penny. This wasn't just a house. It was a symbol, a declaration, a testament to what one man could achieve in a single lifetime. In 1928, the mansion was finished. Ned and Lucy moved in with their 5 children. The family settled into their palace on the hill. Servants bustled through the lower corridors. The children ran through the gardens. Lucy decorated the rooms with furniture and art purchased from Europe. For a brief moment, it seemed like the dream was complete. The Doheny name had reached its highest point. Greystone stood as proof of their success, their power, their permanence. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming, and those cracks ran all the way back to Washington, D.C., to a scandal that would eventually consume everything the Dohenys had built. In the early 1920s, while Greystone was still being planned, Edward Doheny made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It involved oil, politics, and a man named Albert Fall. Albert Fall was the Secretary of the Interior under President Warren G. Harding. A former senator from New Mexico, Fall was a hard-drinking, sharp-dealing politician who controlled access to federal oil reserves, including 2 strategically important sites: Elk Hills in California and Teapot Dome in Wyoming. These reserves were set aside for the U.S. Navy, intended to ensure fuel supplies in case of war. But Fall, who was deeply in debt and desperate for money, saw an opportunity to profit from his position. In 1921, Fall quietly leased the Elk Hills Reserve to Edward Doheny's Pan American Petroleum Company. The deal was done behind closed doors, without competitive bidding, without public notice. In return, Doheny gave Fall a loan of $100,000 in cash, delivered in a black bag by Ned Doheny himself. There was no formal contract, no collateral, no expectation of repayment, no paperwork of any kind. It was, for all practical purposes, a bribe. Fall also leased Teapot Dome to another oil baron, Harry F. Sinclair, in exchange for similar payments and gifts. When the deals became public in 1922, a scandal erupted that shook the nation. Congress launched investigations. Newspapers screamed about corruption at the highest levels of government. The Teapot Dome scandal became one of the most infamous episodes of government corruption in American history, a symbol of the moral rot that many believed had infected the Roaring Twenties. The investigations dragged on for years. Albert Fall was convicted of bribery and became the first cabinet member in U.S. history to go to prison. President Harding died in office before the full extent of the scandal emerged, but his administration's reputation was destroyed. But Edward Doheny, despite being the man who paid the bribe, was acquitted. His lawyers argued brilliantly that the $100,000 was merely a personal loan between old friends, not a payment for illegal favors. They painted Doheny as a generous man helping out a friend in need. The jury believed him, or at least couldn't prove otherwise beyond a reasonable doubt. Doheny walked free, but his reputation was destroyed. The man who had built an empire through hard work and determination was now seen as a symbol of corruption, a robber baron who bought politicians and broke the law to increase his already obscene wealth. The scandal followed him everywhere. Business partners distanced themselves. Society whispered behind his back. His name became synonymous with the worst excesses of American capitalism. And though he still had his wealth, the stain on the Doheny name would never wash away. For Ned Doheny, the scandal was a different kind of burden. He was the one who had delivered the black bag of cash to Albert Fall. He was the courier, the messenger, the physical link between his father and the crime. He had walked into Fall's office, set the bag on the desk, and walked out. Though he was never charged with any crime, though he testified and was cleared, the guilt weighed on him. Friends noticed he drank more heavily than before. He became moody, withdrawn. The easy charm that had defined his youth began to crack. And as the 1920s wore on, those around him began to notice that the golden boy of the Doheny family was slowly unraveling. Still, Greystone was finished. The family moved in, and for a few months, life at the mansion seemed almost normal. The children played in the gardens. Lucy hosted teas and dinner parties. Ned went through the motions of being the master of a great estate. But inside, something was breaking. The weight of the scandal, the pressure of living up to his father's expectations, the guilt and the alcohol, it was all too much. Almost. February 16th, 1929, started as an ordinary day at Greystone. Ned Doheny went about his usual routine. His wife Lucy tended to the children, who ranged in age from infants to young teenagers. The staff moved through the house quietly, performing their duties with the invisible efficiency expected in a home of such stature. By evening, the mansion was calm. The children were put to bed. The servants retreated to their quarters. The February air outside was cool and crisp. Around 10 p.m., Lucy went upstairs to check on Ned. She found him in a guest bedroom on the second floor, a room he sometimes used when he didn't want to disturb her. He wasn't alone. His personal secretary, Hugh Plunkett, was with him. The two men were talking, their voices low and serious. Hugh Plunkett had worked for the Doheny family for years. He was in his mid-30s, well-educated, and completely trusted. Loyal beyond question, he managed Ned's schedule, handled correspondence, dealt with business matters, and served as a companion and confidant. The Dohenys paid him generously. He lived on the estate in a separate cottage, comfortable and secure. He was, by all accounts, part of the family. Ned and Hugh spent hours together every day. Some said they were closer than brothers. Lucy said goodnight and left the two men alone. She went to her own room. She changed into her nightclothes. She picked up a book, and then, within the hour, she heard something that made her blood run cold. 2 gunshots, sharp, loud. Echoing through the stone hallways of Greystone, she ran back to the guest bedroom, her bare feet slapping against the cold floors. The door was locked from the inside. She pounded on it, screaming for Ned. There was no answer. She pounded again, harder, her voice rising in panic. Staff members rushed upstairs, awakened by her screams. Someone called the police. Others tried to break down the door, throwing their weight against the heavy oak. Finally, the lock gave way and the door burst open. Inside, the scene was horrifying. Ned Doheny lay on the floor, a bullet wound in his head. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the carpet. He was dead, his eyes open and staring at nothing. Beside him, crumpled near the bed, was Hugh Plunkett. He had a bullet wound in his own head, the gun still in his hand. The room smelled of gunpowder and death. The police arrived within minutes. They examined the scene carefully. They interviewed Lucy, who was hysterical with grief and shock. They interviewed the staff, none of whom had seen or heard anything unusual before the shots. The household had been quiet. There had been no arguments, no raised voices, no sign of trouble. And within hours, the official story began to take shape. The police quickly declared that Plunkett was responsible for the tragedy. According to their theory, Hugh Plunkett had suffered some kind of mental breakdown and ended both their lives. The motive was never clearly established, but authorities suggested that Plunkett had been struggling with mental illness, perhaps triggered by overwork or personal problems. Some reports claimed he had been having financial troubles. Others suggested he had grown resentful of his position as a servant, no matter how well paid. The case was closed quickly, too quickly, some would later say. Edward Doheny, devastated by his son's death, accepted the official story, or at least he didn't publicly challenge it. What could he do? His son was dead. Challenging the police findings would only drag the family through more scandal, more publicity, more pain. A funeral was held at St. Vincent's Church. Ned was buried in a grand mausoleum. Hugh Plunkett was buried separately in a different cemetery with little ceremony and few mourners. His family, humiliated by the accusation of murder, retreated from public view, and Greystone, barely lived in for even a year, was suddenly empty. But the official story never sat right with people who knew the facts. The doubts began almost immediately and have never stopped. Why would Hugh Plunkett, a man with no history of violence or mental illness, suddenly snap and kill his employer? There was no evidence of a fight, no signs of struggle. The room was orderly except for the two bodies. The furniture was undisturbed. Nothing was broken. If Plunkett had gone violently insane, wouldn't there be some sign of chaos? Why were there 2 gunshots? If Plunkett shot Ned and then himself, why was there so little time between the shots? Lucy heard them in quick succession, almost as if they happened simultaneously, one right after the other, with barely a breath between. Could one man fire twice that fast? And if so, why? Why wouldn't there be a pause, a moment of hesitation before turning the gun on himself? And why, in a house full of staff and family, did no one hear anything leading up to the violence? No raised voices, no arguments, no sounds of distress. Just silence, then gunfire, then screaming. The walls of Greystone were thick stone, but sound still carried through the halls. If there had been a confrontation, wouldn't someone have heard? Some who examined the case more closely began to whisper a different theory. What if the official story was wrong entirely? What if both men were ended by someone else? What if there was a third person in the room that night? Someone who took both their lives and arranged the scene to look like Plunkett had done them both in? This theory gained traction when people considered the larger context. The Teapot Dome scandal was still fresh in the public mind. Edward Doheny's reputation was in tatters. Ned had been the one to deliver the infamous black bag of cash to Albert Fall, making him a key witness to federal crimes. What if someone wanted to silence him? What if there were secrets he knew? Secrets about corruption that reached even higher than Albert Fall, secrets dangerous enough to kill for? What if powerful men in Washington or the oil industry had decided that Ned Doheny knew too much? There were also whispers about Ned's personal life. Some claimed he had been struggling with alcoholism and depression for years, direct consequences of the guilt he carried from Teapot Dome. His drinking had grown heavier, his moods had grown darker. Friends said he sometimes hinted at dark thoughts, at wanting to escape the pressure and the shame forever. Could there have been a secret arrangement? Had Ned asked Hugh to carry out something unspeakable, with both men knowing neither would survive? A bizarre and tragic conclusion to unbearable pain? Others suggested even darker possibilities, that he and Plunkett had been involved in some kind of personal relationship that went beyond employer and employee, a relationship that, in the conservative society of 1920s America, could never be publicly acknowledged. If that were true, and if someone found out, a blackmailer perhaps, or a family member horrified by the scandal, it could explain why both men ended up dead. Honor killings weren't unheard of in that era, especially among wealthy families desperate to protect their reputations. But none of these theories were ever proven. The police didn't investigate deeply. They didn't want to. A quick ruling that blamed Plunkett for everything closed the case and protected everyone involved from further scrutiny. The Doheny family didn't push for answers, whether out of grief or shame or fear of what might be uncovered if the investigation continued. They let the official story stand. Hugh Plunkett, a loyal servant who had dedicated years of his life to the family, was painted as a madman. Ned Doheny, the golden son who was supposed to inherit an empire, was mourned as a victim of senseless tragedy. And the truth, whatever it was buried with them in separate graves. After Ned's death, Lucy Doheny couldn't bear to stay in the mansion. The place where she had hoped to raise her children and build a life had become a house of death. Every room reminded her of that night. Every hallway echoed with the sound of gunshots. She moved out almost immediately, taking the children with her. They would grow up elsewhere, far from Greystone and its shadows. Edward Doheny, heartbroken and aging rapidly, never set foot in Greystone again. The mansion that was meant to be a gift of love, a symbol of his success and his devotion to his son, became a monument to tragedy. He couldn't even look at it. Staff continued to maintain the property, but the rooms echoed with silence. The gardens grew, but no one walked them. Greystone became a ghost house, inhabited only by memories and what-ifs. For years, Greystone sat mostly empty, a beautiful shell with no life inside. The Doheny family tried to move on, but the shadow of that night never lifted. Edward Doheny died in 1935, just 6 years after his son. He was 79 years old. His fortune, once one of the largest in America, was divided and diminished. The oil empire he had built began to fracture and fade. Without Edward's driving force and without Ned to carry on the legacy, the company lost its direction. Competitors took market share. Legal battles over the Teapot Dome, leases drained resources. By the time of Edward's death, the Doheny empire was already in decline. Lucy eventually sold Greystone to the city of Beverly Hills in 1965 for $1.1 million, a fraction of what it cost to build 4 decades earlier. The city turned it into a public park and historic landmark. The mansion became a filming location for movies and television shows, its grand rooms and Gothic architecture providing the perfect backdrop for stories of wealth, mystery, and decay. Ironically, the house built to crown an empire became famous as a set, a place where actors played out fictional dramas, while the real tragedy that had unfolded there was slowly forgotten by the public. But those who worked at Greystone, who walked its halls late at night after tours ended and gates closed, began to tell stories. Security guards reported hearing footsteps echoing through empty corridors when no one else was in the building. Doors that had been carefully locked at night would be found standing open in the morning with no sign of forced entry. Some claimed to see shadows moving through the rooms, dark shapes that vanished when approached or when lights were turned on. There were reports of cold spots, sudden drops in temperature in certain areas of the house that couldn't be explained by drafts or air conditioning. And in the guest bedroom where Ned and Plunkett died, people said they felt an overwhelming sense of sadness, a heaviness that pressed down on them and made it hard to breathe. Some visitors refused to enter that room. Others entered but left quickly, unsettled by feelings they couldn't name. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there is something undeniably eerie about Greystone. The mansion was built with so much hope, so much ambition, so much love. Edward Doheny poured his fortune and his dreams into those stone walls, and it was all destroyed by violence and secrets in a single night. That kind of tragedy leaves a mark that time cannot erase. It seeps into the walls, it changes the air, it becomes part of the place itself. Even on the sunniest days, when the gardens are blooming and the limestone glows warm in the light, there is a darkness at the heart of Greystone that no amount of beauty can erase. Ned's death was the beginning of the end for the Doheny Empire. Edward never recovered from the loss of his son, the oil baron who had once been a titan of industry, who had dragged himself up from poverty through sheer will, became a recluse, haunted by grief and scandal. His company continued to operate, but the heart had gone out of it. The drive that had pushed Edward to succeed, to build, to conquer, died with Ned. The Teapot Dome scandal continued to taint the Doheny name long after the trials ended. Even though Edward had been acquitted in court, the public never forgave him. He was seen as a symbol of everything wrong with the Gilded Age, a man who had bought his way to the top and corrupted the government in the process. When he died in 1935, his obituaries focused as much on the scandal as on his achievements. The oil wells, the fortune, the mansion, all of it was overshadowed by that black bag of cash, and the son who died in the house it helped build. The family fortune was divided among his heirs, but it never regained the concentrated power it had once held. Lucy remarried years later and moved on with her life as best she could. The Doheny children grew up and pursued their own paths, some in business, some in quiet private lives. But Greystone remained, a permanent reminder of the night that changed everything. Over the decades, the mansion took on different roles. It was used for public events, weddings, corporate retreats, garden parties. Film crews transformed it into dozens of different settings. A haunted house in horror films, a mob boss's estate in crime dramas, a presidential mansion in political thrillers, a gothic castle in period pieces. Movies like The Big Lebowski, There Will Be Blood, Spider-Man 3, and X-Men all filmed scenes at Greystone. Television shows from Columbo to The West Wing used its distinctive rooms. The house that was built to be a private sanctuary became one of the most recognized filming locations in Hollywood, appearing in hundreds of productions. But even as it served these new purposes, the mansion never lost its association with tragedy. Tour guides who lead visitors through the estate always pause at the guest bedroom. They lower their voices and tell the story of that February night. And visitors stand in the room where two men died, looking at the walls, the floor, the windows, and wondering what really happened. Some take photographs, some stand in respectful silence, but everyone feels it. The weight of unanswered questions, the presence of something dark that still lingers. Today, Greystone stands beautifully preserved. The city of Beverly Hills has maintained the estate with care, restoring rooms, preserving original features, and keeping the grounds immaculate. Walking through Greystone is like stepping back into the 1920s. The wood paneling still gleams with the same rich luster. The fireplaces still work, their mantels carved from the same marble. The gardens still bloom in careful geometric patterns, maintained by staff who understand the original vision. The limestone exterior, weathered but strong, still catches the light in that ethereal way. But there is an oddness to the place, a sense that time stopped on February 16, 1929, and never quite started again. The mansion was barely lived in before the tragedy. Ned and Lucy had less than a year in the house. Many of the rooms were never fully furnished. They didn't have time to fill the house with the accumulated possessions of a long life, with the photographs and heirlooms and comfortable clutter that make a house a home. So, the estate has an unfinished quality, as if the family just stepped out for the evening and never returned. The rooms are beautiful but empty, perfect but unlived in, a stage set rather than a home. In some ways, Greystone is a perfect metaphor for the Doheny Empire itself. It was built quickly with vast resources and grand ambitions. It was meant to last forever, to stand as a symbol of success and permanence. But it was also built on a foundation of oil wealth that came from questionable deals and corrupt practices. And when the foundation cracked, when the scandal broke and Ned died, the whole structure became unstable. Edward Doheny wanted to give his son a gift that would endure through generations. Instead, he built a mausoleum. Greystone is beautiful. It is impressive. It is architecturally significant. But it is also haunted by the choices that led to its creation and the violence that marked its first and only true chapter as a family home. What can we learn from the story of Greystone Mansion? Perhaps the most obvious lesson is that wealth alone cannot protect us from tragedy. Edward Doheny built a fortune that would have been unimaginable to the boy who grew up poor in Wisconsin. He rose from absolute poverty to become one of the richest men in the world. He built a mansion that embodied everything he had achieved, but none of it could save his son. none of it could prevent the violence that destroyed his family. In the end, all the money in the world, all the power and influence and beautiful architecture couldn't buy peace or safety or happiness. There is also the lesson about corruption and consequences. The Teapot Dome scandal was supposed to be a simple business deal, a way for Edward Doheny to secure oil leases that would make him even richer than he already was. What was another $100,000 when you had hundreds of millions? But the scandal destroyed his reputation, devastated his son, and ultimately contributed to the tragedy at Greystone. The black bag of cash that Ned delivered to Albert Fall set in motion a chain of events that ended with 2 bodies on a bedroom floor. Corruption has a price, and sometimes that price is paid not by the person who commits the crime, but by the next generation. Greystone also teaches us about the American dream and its dark side. Edward Doheny's story is, in many ways, the classic rags to riches tale that America loves to celebrate. He started with nothing and built an empire through hard work, determination, and a little bit of luck. He proved that anyone, no matter how poor, could make it to the top. But the dream turned into a nightmare. The mansion he built to crown his success became the symbol of his failure. The son he loved and wanted to protect died violently in a house meant to keep him safe. The empire crumbled. The name was ruined. In the end, the American dream consumed the dreamer. And finally, Greystone reminds us that some mysteries are never solved. We will never know for certain what happened in that guest bedroom on February 16, 1929. Was it truly what the police claimed? One man responsible for both deaths? Was it a double elimination covered up by powerful forces? Was it an agreement between 2 men who saw no other way out? The truth died with Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett. All we have are questions, theories, whispers, and the silent testimony of the mansion itself. Today, visitors to Greystone walk through rooms that feel both grand and empty. They admire the architecture, the craftsmanship, the sweeping views. They take photographs in the gardens, standing where Lucy once stood, where the children once played. They imagine what it must have been like to live in such a place, to wake up in a palace every morning. But underneath the beauty, there is always the awareness of what happened here. The tragedy is inescapable. It is woven into the fabric of the house like a thread that runs through every room, every hallway, every stone. Some say that Greystone is cursed, that the wealth used to build it was tainted from the beginning, earned through deals that bent the law and broke the trust of the American people, that the mansion itself was doomed before the first stone was laid, marked by the corruption that financed its construction. Whether you believe in curses or not, it's hard to deny that Greystone's history is remarkably dark. 1 family, 1 night, 2 deaths, and an empire that crumbled into dust. Others say that Greystone is simply a reminder of how fragile success can be. Edward Doheny spent decades building his fortune. He survived boom and bust, competition and challenge, poverty and hardship. He made it to the very top of American society, higher than he ever dreamed possible as a boy in Wisconsin. But all of that success, all of that wealth, all of that power couldn't prevent the destruction of what mattered most to him, his family. 1 night erased decades of work. 1 tragedy destroyed a dynasty. The mansion stands as a monument to ambition, to the heights one man could reach, and to the depths of tragedy that can follow. It is a place of beauty and horror, of grandeur and grief, and it will stand on that hillside above Beverly Hills for decades to come, perhaps centuries, a silent witness to a story that America would rather forget. If you visit Greystone today, go in the late afternoon, when the sunlight is golden and the shadows are long. Walk through the gardens slowly, stand on the terrace and look out over the city spreading below. Feel the weight of the place pressing down on you. And when you step inside, when you walk through those grand rooms with their carved wood and stone fireplaces, remember that this was not always a movie set or a public park. This was someone's home, someone's dream. It was built by a father who wanted to give his son the world. It was meant to be a palace of joy, a place where children would grow and generations would gather, and the Doheny name would live forever in stone and memory. Instead, it became the site of a tragedy that destroyed an empire and left questions that will never be answered. Greystone Mansion is many things. It is beautiful, undeniably so. It is historic, a landmark of 1920s architecture and design. It is architecturally significant, studied by students and admired by experts. But more than anything, it is a reminder that no amount of wealth can protect us from the darkness that lives in human hearts, that the grandest dreams can become nightmares, that empires built on shadows will eventually be consumed by them. The gray stone walls rise against the California sky, elegant and eternal. But look closely, and you can see the cracks, the places where time and tragedy have left their marks. Listen carefully, and you can hear the echoes that refuse to fade. 2 gunshots, a family destroyed, an empire that fell not from the outside, but from within, destroyed by its own corruption and secrets. Greystone stands, but the Doheny name is gone, remembered now only in history books and scandal. The oil empire is dust, broken up and absorbed by other companies, and all that remains is the mansion, beautiful and empty, haunted by the ghosts of ambition, corruption, and tragedy. A palace that was meant to last forever, but destroyed everything it touched. This is the dark story of Greystone, a house built on dreams, stained by scandal, and marked forever by the violence that ended it all before it ever truly began. When most people picture Newport, Rhode Island, they think of postcard-perfect scenes, the sharp cliffs dropping into the Atlantic, the famous cliff walk winding along the coastline, and the enormous mansions rising from manicured lawns like transplanted European palaces. Newport was America's summer playground during the Gilded Age, a place where the wealthiest families in the country gathered each year to display their fortunes, host extravagant parties, and live in a world so removed from ordinary life that it seemed almost fictional. But behind the beauty of Newport's famous estates, behind the perfectly trimmed hedges and the glittering chandeliers, there are stories that tourists rarely hear. Stories of tragedy, scandal, and secrets buried beneath layers of wealth and privilege. And perhaps no mansion in Newport carries a darker shadow than Rough Point, the sprawling stone fortress perched on one of the most dramatic pieces of coastline in all of New England. Today, Rough Point stands as a museum, its 105 rooms preserved exactly as they were left by its most famous owner, Doris Duke, the woman the world once called the richest girl in the world. Visitors walk through halls filled with priceless paintings by Van Dyck and Renoir, Ming Dynasty ceramics worth millions, and furniture that once belonged to Catherine the Great. They stand at windows overlooking the Atlantic, admiring views that have captivated generations of the ultra-wealthy. They marvel at the opulence, the taste, the sheer extravagance of it all. But what most of those visitors don't know, what the museum guides rarely mention, is that on a quiet October evening in 1966, a man died at the gates of this mansion under circumstances that have never been fully explained. His name was Eduardo Tirella. He was Doris Duke's interior designer, a decorated World War II hero, and a man who had just told his employer he was leaving for a promising career in Hollywood. Within hours of that conversation, he was dead, crushed between a station wagon and the heavy iron gates at the estate's entrance. The official story called it an accident, a terrible, tragic mistake. But from the very beginning, witnesses whispered a different tale. They spoke of arguments, of screams, of a car that seemed to accelerate rather than stop. And they wondered whether America's richest woman had used her immense fortune to escape the consequences of what really happened that night. For nearly 60 years, the case remained closed, buried under layers of silence, wealth, and the kind of power that only extreme money can buy. But in 2021, a witness who had been silent for more than half a century finally came forward, reopening wounds that Newport had tried to forget. As we stand at the gates of Rough Point and look up at the stone walls that have witnessed so much history, we have to ask ourselves, what secrets does this mansion hold? And did the woman who lived here, surrounded by beauty and priceless treasures, get away with murder? To understand the story of Rough Point, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a time when this stretch of coastline was considered too wild, too exposed, too dangerous for civilized habitation. In the 1880s, Newport was transforming from a quiet colonial town into the undisputed summer capital of American wealth, where the richest families in the country were building estates that dwarfed anything America had seen before. But even among Newport's elite, there was one piece of land that stood apart. It was a rocky promontory that jutted out into the Atlantic like a fist raised against the sea. Waves crashed against jagged rocks with relentless fury. Winter storms battered the point with winds that could strip paint from wood and tear shingles from roofs. The land was so rugged, so constantly assaulted by the elements, that locals had given it a name that was more warning than description: Rough Point. In 1887, Frederick William Vanderbilt, the sixth son of William H. Vanderbilt and heir to one of America's greatest railroad fortunes, decided that this wild, untamed piece of coastline was exactly where he wanted to build his summer home. He hired the prestigious architectural firm Peabody and Stearns and landscape designer Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who created Central Park, to transform this savage outcropping into something extraordinary. What they created rose from the rocky coastline like a medieval fortress. Built from red sandstone and granite, the mansion stretched across 39,000 square feet in the English manorial style, with towers, turrets, and 105 rooms crafted with unlimited wealth and ambition. The cost was staggering: $1 million in 1890s currency, equivalent to over $30 million today. Construction was completed in 1892, and Rough Point was reported as the largest and most expensive residence in America during its construction, the fifth largest of Newport's grand estates. What made Rough Point truly special was its relationship with the ocean. While other mansions sat safely back from the water, Rough Point thrust itself out into the sea. The house felt alive, constantly buffeted by wind and spray, its windows offering views that seemed to stretch to infinity. The mansion didn't just overlook the ocean, it confronted it, challenged it, dared it to do its worst. The Vanderbilt family spent their summers at Rough Point during the 1890s and early 1900s, entertaining Newport society in the kind of luxury that seems almost impossible to imagine today. But the Vanderbilts were restless owners, constantly building new estates, and by 1906, Frederick had sold Rough Point to move on to other projects. The new owner was William B. Leeds, a self-made millionaire known as the Tin Plate King, who had built his fortune in steel manufacturing. Leeds purchased Rough Point for $400,000 and set about making it his own, hosting lavish parties and cementing his place in Newport society. But Leeds's tenure was brief. He died in 1908, and his widow eventually remarried and moved on. For more than a decade, Rough Point passed through various hands, its future uncertain, until 1922, when it found the owner who would transform it into legend. That owner was James Buchanan Duke, and his name carried weight that even the Vanderbilts would have respected. James B. Duke had built one of the most powerful business empires in American history. Starting from modest beginnings in North Carolina, he had revolutionized the tobacco industry, created the American Tobacco Company, and amassed a fortune so vast that it placed him among the richest men in the world. By the time he purchased Rough Point in 1922, Duke controlled not just tobacco, but hydroelectric power, real estate, and banking. He was a titan of industry, a man whose business decisions could shape entire regions. Duke purchased Rough Point as a summer retreat, a place where he could escape the pressures of his empire and enjoy the ocean air. He filled it with fine art and furnishings, transforming it into a showcase befitting his status. But Duke's time at Rough Point was tragically brief. In 1925, just 3 years after purchasing the estate, James Buchanan Duke died of complications from pneumonia. He was 68 years old. His death set in motion one of the most extraordinary inheritance stories in American history. Duke's only child was his daughter Doris, and she was just 12 years old when her father died. In an instant, this young girl became the sole heir to a fortune estimated at $80 million, an almost incomprehensible sum that made her, by many accounts, the richest child in the world. The newspapers couldn't get enough of the story. The richest girl in the world became Doris Duke's unofficial title, a label that would follow her for the rest of her life. But the reality of inheriting such vast wealth at such a young age was far more complicated than the fairy tale headlines suggested. Also by isolation. Her father had been a demanding, controlling presence, and her mother, Nanaline, was more concerned with social standing than maternal warmth. After her father's death, Doris found herself even more isolated, surrounded by lawyers, trustees, and advisors who managed her fortune but couldn't replace family. She was educated by private tutors, raised in mansions, and taught to behave with the dignity expected of someone in her position. But she was also a child, and the weight of her inheritance was crushing. The media scrutiny was relentless. Every aspect of her life became public property. Photographers followed her everywhere. Newspapers speculated about her future, her marriage prospects, her spending habits. She couldn't go anywhere without being recognized, couldn't make friends without wondering if they wanted her money, couldn't trust anyone completely. In 1929, when Doris turned 17, her mother threw her a debutante ball at Rough Point that became legendary in Newport society. 2,000 guests attended, arriving in a procession of cars that stretched for miles. The mansion was decorated with thousands of flowers. Orchestras played, champagne flowed. It was everything a debutante ball should be. And yet, those who knew Doris said she seemed miserable, trapped by the expectations of her position. As she grew older, Doris Duke tried to forge her own path. She married twice, both marriages ending in divorce. Her first marriage, to James Cromwell, fell apart after 6 years of increasing bitterness. Her second, to Dominican diplomat Porfirio Rubirosa, lasted less than a year. Both men had been accused of marrying her for her money, accusations that cut deeply and reinforced her isolation. She traveled extensively, developing a passion for Islamic art and architecture that would shape her collecting for decades. She studied languages, immersed herself in other cultures, and brought back treasures from around the world. She became involved in historic preservation, founding the Newport Restoration Foundation in 1968, and personally saving more than 80 colonial buildings from demolition. She spent millions of her own money buying up derelict 18th century houses and restoring them to their original condition, often renting them out at rates far below market value simply to see them lived in and loved. She was a woman of genuine culture and taste, far more than just a wealthy heiress. But she was also, by all accounts, complicated. People who knew her described her as brilliant but imperious, generous but controlling, curious but isolated. She could be charming one moment and cold the next. She expected perfection from everyone around her and rarely offered praise when she received it. She was known for testing people, setting up situations to see if they would betray her or try to take advantage of her wealth. The vast wealth that gave her so much freedom also trapped her in a gilded cage. She never knew if people liked her for herself or for her money. She trusted few and confided in fewer still. Staff members who worked for her for years said they never felt they truly knew her. Friends kept their distance, never quite sure when her mood might turn or when they might suddenly be cut out of her life for some perceived slight. Rough Point became her refuge, the place where she felt most at home. She spent months there each year, walking the grounds, overseeing the gardens, and constantly refining the interiors. The mansion became a reflection of her exquisite taste and her obsession with beauty. She filled Rough Point with one of the finest private art collections in America. Paintings by Van Dyck, Gainsborough, Reynolds, and Renoir hung on the walls. She collected Ming Dynasty ceramics, displayed in custom-built cases. 16th century tapestries from Versailles covered the walls of the music room. Furniture that had belonged to Catherine the Great occupied places of honor. Every object was carefully chosen, every placement deliberate. Walking through Rough Point was like walking through a world-class museum, except that one woman lived there, surrounded by these treasures. She kept the estate meticulously maintained. Fresh vegetables and herbs were shipped from Duke Farms in New Jersey each week. The gardens were tended by a full-time staff. The house was cleaned and polished constantly. Nothing was allowed to decay or fall into disrepair. And then there were the camels. In the 1980s, Saudi billionaire Adnan Khashoggi gave Doris 2 Bactrian camels as gifts. She named them Princess and Baby, and they lived on the grounds of Rough Point, where they became beloved fixtures of the estate. During Hurricane Bob in 1991, the camels took shelter in the mansion's solarium, and Doris sat with them through the storm. After they died, she had camel-shaped topiaries created on the front lawn as a memorial. It was the kind of eccentric gesture that captured both her whimsy and her deep attachment to the things and creatures she loved. But for all the beauty she surrounded herself with, For all the art and gardens and carefully curated elegance, Doris Duke remained fundamentally isolated. The wealth that gave her so much also separated her from ordinary human connection. And it was this isolation, this fundamental loneliness, that perhaps made what happened in October 1966 even more devastating. Because by that time, Doris Duke had found someone she trusted, someone who understood her taste, someone who seemed to genuinely care about her and her projects. His name was Eduardo Tirella, and he was about to become the dark secret that Rough Point could never escape. Eduardo Tirella was 42 years old in 1966, and by all accounts, he was a man of considerable talent and charm. Born in Italy and raised in Pennsylvania, he had served in World War II with distinction, earning a Bronze Star for his actions during the Battle of the Bulge. Those who knew him from the war remembered a man of courage and compassion, someone who risked his own safety to help wounded soldiers under fire. After the war, he studied design and quickly made a name for himself in the world of interior decoration. He had an eye for color, a gift for spatial arrangement, and the kind of creative vision that wealthy clients valued. But he was more than just a decorator. He understood art history, could discuss Renaissance paintings with the same ease that he could source the perfect fabric for a drawing room. He had traveled extensively, absorbing influences from European design traditions and bringing them back to his work in America. Doris Duke had hired him as her interior designer and cultural consultant, and over the years, their professional relationship had deepened into something more complicated. Eduardo became one of her confidants, someone she relied on not just for his design expertise but for his company. They traveled together to Europe and the Middle East, visiting museums and galleries, searching for pieces to add to her collection. They worked together at Rough Point, spending long hours discussing color palettes, furniture placement, and the overall aesthetic she wanted to achieve. He understood her vision, but he also had the courage to push back when he thought she was wrong, a quality that few people in her orbit possessed. For Eduardo, working for Doris Duke was prestigious and lucrative. She paid him $43,000 a year, an excellent salary in the 1960s, and she gave him access to the kind of high-end projects that most designers could only dream about. He worked with priceless antiques, commissioned custom pieces from the finest craftsmen, and had essentially unlimited resources to realize his creative vision. It should have been paradise for a designer. But there was also a cost. Doris was demanding, controlling, and intensely focused on her own vision. She wanted what she wanted, and she didn't like being told no. Eduardo found himself increasingly trapped by her expectations, his own creative ambitions subordinated to her desires. He was on call constantly, expected to be available whenever she wanted to discuss a project or show him something she had acquired. His life had become consumed by her needs, her projects, her endless quest for perfection. By 1966, Eduardo had decided he wanted more. He had been offered opportunities in Hollywood, working as a set designer for films. It was a chance to break free from Doris's orbit, to make a name for himself in a different arena, to have creative control over his own work. Hollywood in the 1960s was entering a new era, and Eduardo saw possibilities there that excited him in ways that working for Doris no longer did. He had made up his mind to leave, and in early October, he told Doris Duke of his decision. According to people who heard about it later, the conversation did not go well. Doris didn't like being abandoned. She didn't like losing people she had come to depend on. And she especially didn't like the idea that Eduardo was choosing Hollywood, with all its glamour and excitement, over her and Rough Point. Some who knew her said she took it as a personal betrayal. She had given him access to her life, her homes, her collections. She had trusted him with her vision for Rough Point. She had paid him well, given him opportunities that other designers would have killed for. And now he was leaving, choosing something else over her. For a woman who struggled with abandonment and trust, Eduardo's decision must have felt like the worst kind of rejection. The final day of Eduardo Tirella's life was October 7th, 1966. It was a Friday, and he had been working at Rough Point, wrapping up projects and preparing for his departure. The weather was mild, the kind of crisp autumn day that makes Newport especially beautiful. Eduardo planned to drive back to his home later that evening, but first, he and Doris had to leave the estate together. She was going to sit in her car while Eduardo opened the heavy iron gates at the entrance. It was a routine task, something that happened every time someone entered or left the property. The gates were solid and substantial, operated by hand, and it took a moment to swing them open wide enough for a car to pass through. What happened next has been the subject of speculation, investigation, and controversy for nearly 60 years. According to Doris Duke's account, given to police shortly after the incident, she was sitting in her station wagon with Eduardo in the passenger seat as they approached the gates. Eduardo got out to open them. While he was doing so, Doris's foot slipped. Instead of pressing the brake, she accidentally hit the accelerator. The car lurched forward, striking Eduardo and crushing him against the iron gates. It was, she claimed, a horrible accident, a tragic mistake, a momentary error that resulted in a man's death. But there were problems with this story from the very beginning. Problems that witnesses noted, that first responders questioned, and that would haunt the investigation for decades. The first problem was the physical evidence. Eduardo wasn't just struck by the car. According to the police report and eyewitness accounts, he was thrown onto the hood of the vehicle. His body landed face down on the hood, and he was staring through the windshield directly at Doris Duke. He was alive when this happened. He was conscious, and according to some accounts, he was screaming. At this point, Doris Duke could have stopped. She could have braked immediately, reversed, gotten out to help. But according to several witnesses, she didn't. The car paused, Eduardo staring at her through the glass, and then the car accelerated again. It surged forward with Eduardo still on the hood, crushing him between the vehicle and the gates with such force that the impact was fatal. A 13-year-old paperboy named Bob Walker was nearby when it happened. He heard two distinct impacts. He heard a man screaming, "No!" The sounds were so disturbing that they stayed with him for the rest of his life. But in 1966, Bob Walker was just a frightened child, and he didn't come forward to tell anyone what he had heard. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. Eduardo Tirella was dead at the scene. His body was crushed, the injuries catastrophic, and Doris Duke, the richest woman in America, was sitting in her car, waiting to give her statement to the police. The Newport Police Department responded to the scene, led by Chief Joseph Radice. What happened over the next 96 hours would set the tone for everything that followed. Chief Radice interviewed Doris Duke briefly. He examined the scene, he reviewed the physical evidence, and within 4 days, less than a week after a man died under suspicious circumstances, Chief Radice declared Eduardo Tirella's death an unfortunate accident. No charges were filed. No deeper investigation was conducted. No forensic analysis was done to determine the speed of the vehicle or the mechanics of the collision. No one questioned why there were two impacts instead of one, or why Eduardo's body ended up on the hood facing Doris through the windshield. The case was closed almost before it began. The speed of the investigation, or rather, the lack of investigation, raised eyebrows among those who heard about it. In 1966, Newport was still a small city where everyone knew everyone, and the Newport Police Department was not equipped to investigate suspicious deaths involving people of extreme wealth and power. Whether Chief Radice was simply out of his depth, or whether other factors influenced his decision, remains unclear. But people whispered. They whispered about the argument that Eduardo and Doris had earlier that day, the shouting match that several staff members had heard. They whispered about Eduardo's plans to leave, about Doris's anger and jealousy. They whispered about how convenient it was that Eduardo died just as he was about to escape her orbit. They whispered about the fact that Doris Duke was one of the richest women in the world, that her lawyers were formidable, that she had connections at every level of society, and they whispered about money. Because in the years following Eduardo's death, several people connected to the investigation suddenly seemed to have more resources than before. Chief Radice, who had so quickly ruled the death an accident, reportedly came into money. Others who might have asked uncomfortable questions found themselves in better financial positions. Nothing was ever proven, and no one was ever charged with accepting bribes or obstructing justice. But the rumors persisted, growing stronger with each passing year, suggesting that Doris Duke hadn't just gotten away with negligent homicide, or worse. She had paid for the privilege. Eduardo Tirella's family didn't believe the official story. His 8 siblings knew their brother, knew how careful he was, knew that something didn't add up about Doris Duke's account. They couldn't understand how a man who had survived the Battle of the Bulge could die in such a bizarre accident. They couldn't accept that their brother's death would be dismissed so quickly, investigated so superficially. In 1971, they filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Doris Duke. It was a brave act, taking on one of the richest women in the world, challenging her version of events in civil court. The case dragged on for years, consuming time and money that the Torella family didn't have. Lawyers were expensive. Doris Duke's legal team was formidable, comprised of some of the most skilled attorneys money could buy. They filed motions, demanded depositions, and used every legal tactic available to delay and complicate the proceedings. But the Torella family persisted, driven by love for their brother and a desperate need for justice. They weren't wealthy people. Eduardo had been their success story, the brother who had made something of himself, who had survived the war and built a career doing something he loved. His death had devastated them, and the quick dismissal of the case by Newport police had added insult to injury. They wanted someone to acknowledge that Eduardo's life had mattered, that his death deserved proper investigation, that Doris Duke should be held accountable for what happened. The legal battle took an emotional toll. Family members had to relive Eduardo's death over and over, answering questions from lawyers, sitting through depositions, enduring the subtle and not so subtle implications that they were simply trying to extract money from a rich woman. Doris Duke's attorneys painted them as opportunists, suggesting that their grief was performative and their motives financial. It was cruel and exhausting, but they refused to give up. In 1975, 4 years after filing the suit, they finally got their day in court. The jury heard the evidence, considered the testimony, and reached a verdict. Doris Duke was found civilly negligent in Eduardo Torella's death. The jury determined that her actions had caused his death, that she bore responsibility for what happened at those gates. It should have been a vindication. It should have meant something. But the financial reality told a different story. After legal fees and expenses, Eduardo's 8 siblings each received approximately $5,620. This was the value that the court placed on their brother's life. A man who earned $43,000 a year, a decorated war veteran, a talented designer with dreams of Hollywood, reduced to $5,620 per family member. Doris Duke, whose weekly interest on her fortune by that time exceeded $1 million, paid the settlement without blinking. For her, it was pocket change, a minor inconvenience. For the Torella family, it was an insult, a final confirmation that wealth could buy not just freedom from criminal prosecution, but also immunity from meaningful civil consequences. The case closed again. The years passed. Doris Duke continued to live at Rough Point, surrounded by her treasures, hosting visitors, working on her preservation projects. If she thought about Eduardo Torella, if she felt guilt or remorse or any emotion about what happened, she never spoke of it publicly. The incident became, in the official version of her life, an unfortunate accident from long ago, something to be glossed over or ignored entirely. But the truth has a way of refusing to stay buried. And in 2021, 55 years after Eduardo Torella's death, the case that everyone thought was settled forever suddenly broke open again. Bob Walker, the paperboy who had heard Eduardo's screams that October evening in 1966, had carried that memory for more than half a century. He had never forgotten the sounds, never stopped wondering what really happened. As he grew older, as the years accumulated, the weight of his silence became unbearable. He knew something that might matter. He had heard something that might be important. And he finally decided that it was time to speak. In August 2021, now in his late 60s, Bob Walker contacted Detective Jacques West of the Newport Police Department. He told her what he remembered from that day in 1966. He described the 2 distinct impacts, the sound of a man screaming, the terrible realization that something violent and wrong had occurred. His testimony didn't prove murder, but it contradicted key elements of Doris Duke's story. If Eduardo had been screaming, if there were 2 impacts rather than 1, then the accidental acceleration story became much harder to believe. Bob Walker's decision to come forward wasn't made lightly. For 55 years, he had carried the weight of what he heard. He had been just 13 years old in 1966, a paperboy doing his route, and the sounds he heard that evening had haunted him ever since. As a child, he had been afraid to speak up. He didn't think anyone would believe him. He worried about what might happen if he accused Doris Duke, one of the most powerful people in Newport, of something terrible. So, he stayed silent even as the years passed and Eduardo's death was officially ruled an accident. But as Walker grew older, the silence became unbearable. He thought about Eduardo Tirella, about the man whose screams he had heard, about a life cut short and a death never properly investigated. He thought about Eduardo's family, about how they must have felt knowing that justice was never served, and he decided that it was time to tell the truth, regardless of the consequences. The Newport Police Department, faced with new witness testimony in a case that had long been considered closed, made a decision. They would reopen the investigation. They would review the evidence, interview witnesses who were still alive, and determine whether there was sufficient cause to change the official ruling. For the Tirella family, for those who had always believed that something wrong happened that October evening, it felt like vindication might finally be possible. For 5 months, Detective West worked the case. She interviewed people who had known both Doris and Eduardo. She reviewed the old police reports, looking for inconsistencies and overlooked details. She tried to reconstruct what had happened on that October evening decades ago. She examined the physical evidence that still existed, though much had been lost or destroyed over the years. She tracked down former staff members from Rough Point, people who might have heard or seen something relevant. It was painstaking work, made more difficult by the passage of time. Witnesses had died, memories had faded, physical evidence had disappeared. The original investigation had been so cursory that there wasn't much to work with. But Detective West persisted, driven by the same sense of justice that had motivated Bob Walker to finally come forward. But in January 2022, the Newport Police Department announced its conclusion. There was insufficient new evidence to change the original ruling. Eduardo Tirella's death would remain classified as an accident. Bob Walker's testimony, while compelling, wasn't enough to override the official story that had been in place for more than 50 years. The decision felt like a betrayal to those who had hoped for justice. It felt like history repeating itself, wealth and power winning again, uncomfortable truths being swept back under the rug. The case closed for what seemed like the final time, but the questions didn't close. They couldn't, because Bob Walker's testimony had reopened wounds that Newport had tried to forget, and it had reminded people that some stories demand to be told, even when powerful forces want them silenced. Doris Duke died in 1993 at the age of 80, and her final years were as controversial as much of her life had been. She died alone at Falcon's Lair, her Beverly Hills estate, with only her butler, Bernard Lafferty, present. The circumstances of her death raised immediate questions. Lafferty, who had worked for her for only a few years, had somehow become the executor of her massive estate, a position that gave him enormous power over her billion-dollar fortune. Suspicions swirled about whether Lafferty had manipulated Doris in her final years, whether he had isolated her from others, whether her will reflected her true wishes or his influence. Legal battles erupted. Family members challenged the will. Lawyers fought over the fortune. It was a messy, undignified end for a woman who had spent her life surrounded by beauty and careful control. In her will, Doris left Rough Point to the Newport Restoration Foundation with specific instructions that it be opened as a museum, preserved exactly as she had left it. In 2000, the mansion opened to the public, and visitors have been coming ever since, walking through the rooms she loved, admiring the collections she assembled, standing at the windows where she once stood. But they walk through without knowing the full story. They don't know about Eduardo Tirella unless they specifically seek out the information. There's no plaque at the gates where he died, no memorial in the museum, no acknowledgement in the official tours that a man lost his life there under circumstances that remain deeply suspicious. Standing at Rough Point today, looking up at the mansion with its towers and turrets, its windows overlooking the Atlantic, its rooms filled with priceless art, it's easy to be dazzled by the beauty and grandeur. This is what wealth can create: spaces of extraordinary elegance, collections that span centuries and continents, gardens that take your breath away. But Rough Point also teaches us something darker. It teaches us that beauty can coexist with tragedy, that privilege can shield people from consequences, that the pursuit of perfection in one's surroundings can sometimes blind us to the imperfection of our actions. Doris Duke spent decades making Rough Point beautiful. She filled it with treasures. She opened it to the public after her death. She wanted to be remembered as a collector, a preservationist, a woman of culture and taste, and in many ways, she succeeded. The museum that bears her stamp is indeed extraordinary, but she also wanted people to forget Eduardo Tirella, or at least to accept without question that his death was an accident. She wanted the questions to go away, the whispers to stop, the investigations to remain closed, and here too she largely succeeded. The official story remains unchanged. The gates where Eduardo died have no plaque, no memorial. Most visitors to Rough Point have never heard his name, yet those of us who know the story cannot walk through Rough Point without thinking of him. We cannot admire the drawing room without wondering if Eduardo helped choose the fabrics. We cannot look at the careful arrangement of artwork without remembering that he had an eye for beauty and a talent for creating harmonious spaces. We cannot pass through those iron gates without hearing, in our imagination, the scream that Bob Walker heard 55 years ago. Eduardo Tirella's ghost haunts Rough Point, not because he chooses to, but because his story was never properly told, his death was never properly investigated, and his life was never properly valued. So we return to the question posed at the beginning. What really happened on October 7th, 1966? Was it truly an accident, as Doris Duke claimed? Did her foot slip, causing her to press the accelerator instead of the brake? Or was there something more? Did she deliberately drive toward Eduardo, intending to scare him, only to lose control? Was she so upset about his decision to leave that she acted out of anger or jealousy? Or was she simply negligent, reckless, creating a dangerous situation that resulted in Eduardo's death? We may never know the complete truth. The people who could tell us are gone. The physical evidence has disappeared. The investigation that might have revealed what really happened was never properly conducted. But what we do know is this. A man died at the gates of Rough Point under circumstances suspicious enough to raise serious questions. Those questions were dismissed quickly by local police. When his family fought for justice in civil court, they won their case but received a pittance in compensation. For decades, the story was buried, erased from the official narrative of Rough Point and Doris Duke's life. And when a witness finally came forward 55 years later, his testimony was deemed insufficient to reopen the case. At every turn, wealth and power protected Doris Duke from the scrutiny and consequences that an ordinary person would have faced. Whether she was guilty of murder, negligent homicide, or simply involved in a tragic accident, the system failed to properly investigate and failed to deliver justice. The gates at Rough Point stand today as a reminder of that failure. They welcome visitors to one of America's finest house museums, but they are also a memorial, whether officially recognized or not, to Eduardo Tirella, the decorated war veteran, the talented designer, the man with dreams of Hollywood who died trying to leave the employ of the richest woman in the world. Behind the beauty of Newport's mansions, behind the elegance of America's Gilded Age estates, there are always stories that complicate our understanding. The same wealth that created these magnificent buildings also created systems of power that protected the wealthy from accountability. The same privilege that allowed families like the Dukes to collect priceless art also allowed them to escape consequences that would have destroyed ordinary lives. Rough Point is a monument to beauty, culture, and preservation, but it is also a monument to the questions we stopped asking, the investigations we didn't pursue, and the justice we failed to deliver. Eduardo Tirella's story reminds us that these questions matter, that every life has value regardless of wealth or status, and that truth should not be for sale to the highest bidder. As the ocean continues to crash against the rocks, as the gates continue to swing open for visitors, as the treasures inside continue to dazzle those who come to see them, Eduardo Tirella's death remains what it has always been, a dark story that Rough Point can never fully escape, a shadow that falls across even the most beautiful rooms, a reminder that some questions deserve answers even when those answers are uncomfortable for the powerful. Did America's richest woman get away with murder? The gates at Rough Point hold that secret still, silent witnesses to a truth that may never be fully known.